There are perhaps some aspects of the quarrel in Vietnam that touch especially on your thesis and your concern and the whole nature of it. And that is the suspicion that some people have of a double standard, of selective indignation. For instance, you refer to the heroic Vietnamese resistance to American power.
I think it's absolutely heroic.
Yeah, sure.
Amazing.
Now, I understand I understand enough about language to understand the use of heroism in that way.
If you notice, there are a few lines below I say, or above I say something about quite apart from any question of politics.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Right. Now, suppose I were to write about the heroic resistance of the Nazis to the Liberation Army, for instance, their use of torture, the use of mass reprisals.
I don't consider that heroic.
Well, why isn't that heroic? I mean, that means that they were doing everything they possibly could.
No, I don't think that heroism doesn't. Well, then I think we do disagree on the use of language.
Well,
I don't think that reprisals against
we do know that Viet
population
Cong have used fire weapons to destroy whole villages, children, that they have disemboweled mayors and so on and so forth and hung them up and all that kind of stuff. Now, this is heroic, I understand.
No, that is not. Oh. That's depraved.
That's depraved.
In my opinion. Yeah.
So
but that's very, very marginal in the Viet Cong.
Well, why is it marginal?
In fact, it's marginal. That's a question of fact. And
it's a question of fact, yeah.
The question, in fact, you know, this, it's quite, you know, I think there's perfect unanimity about this in the people who've studied it. For example, if you look at someone like, say, Douglas Pike, you know, American Foreign Service agent, as the chief expert on the Viet Cong, and you read his book carefully, you discover that he points out that it was in response to the American military effort that the Viet Cong turned from their attempt to build mass popular support by through the organizational methods that involved giving people an actual role in organizing and controlling their own society and institutions. They turned from that to physical force in reaction to the American intervention. Well, and if I have many examples of this quoted in the book from aid documents, let's say, or from pacification manuals where people point out...
By the same token, you can say that the Nazis turned to torture in France in reaction to Eisenhower's landing in Normandy. The answer is that people so disposed to act are certain kinds of people, and I yearn for a recognition of this in your writings or in Douglas Pike's. As a matter of fact, Douglas Pike, as you know, has certain difficulty with the fact that it is acknowledged that up to 25,000, 30,000 people were individually killed by terrorists before.
When was that?
America's, it was between 1958 and 1962.
I think a 9,000 is the figure that's given usually.
Well,
right, and it's interesting to see what it was. I mean, if one really wants to talk about Viet Cong terror during the period prior to the American intervention, then again, I think just about all commentators, Dennis Werner, Bernard Fall, whoever you like, has agreed that by and large, this was terror directed extremely selectively against oppressive and external village officials.
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective.
Pardon?
The burning of Joan of Arc was selective, too.
But I think
the point is it was intended to establish a universal point.
It was
so
intended
was the execution of Eichmann selective.
Well, but you see, there's a very big difference. I think, you see, if you want to, personally, I'm against all kinds of terror, no question. But if you want to understand the Viet Cong situation, then let's recognize a very great distinction, at least I recognize. Let's see what the political point of the terror was. See, after all, during that period, there were about 9 or 10,000, according to American sources, there were maybe 9 or 10,000 village officials of one sort or another killed by the Viet Cong, largely with the support of the villages. That's what. But at the same time, recall that there were perhaps 160,000 Vietnamese, if we accept Bernard Fall's figures again, killed by the Saigon government and the Americans. This is prior to 1965. That was a very different kind of terror, both in quantity and also in its political content.
Yeah, I know, but it seems to me that you are attempting here to match things which are not equal.
No, 9,000 and 160,000 are by no means equal, nor is the political point.
I need to say that. I'm prepared to answer that. My point is that one presumably distinguishes between an act of terrorism, which you called depraved a moment ago,
well, what you described, like burning a village, is depraved.
Yeah, a military action
which is equally
part of
depraved,
military operation.
which is even more depraved. For example, you see, well, let me give you some examples of what I consider depraved actions. Malcolm Brown, back in 1962 or 3, I don't remember, reported, it was I think AP or UP correspondent, reported that Saigon officials were sending American Skyhawks, you know, airplanes over Vietnamese villages to wipe them out with napalm raids in order to cover instances of graft, for example. Well, that's, I think, depraved. Incidentally, I don't condemn that because, you see, just to mention this matter of double standard, there are really three kinds of terror in Vietnam. There's Viet Cong terror, there's the Saigon government terror, and there's American terror. And if you read what I've written, I say practically nothing about either Viet Cong terror or terror carried out by the Saigon government. Now, if one wanted to talk about that, one would have to point out that the terror carried out by the Saigon government is incredibly greater in extent and has a very different political purpose, which one could discuss. But I restrict myself to discussing American terror.
On that generality, but,
well,
but I gather that you believe it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do, and we could, that then does become a matter of fact, which one could discuss. Yeah, but I, as a matter of principle, almost restrict myself to the discussion of American terror. Not the terror carried out by the various sides in Vietnam, for many reasons. For one thing, because it's just qualitatively different in scale, and for another thing, because I feel that we have some responsibility for it. See, I don't. In the same sense, I don't talk about, I've never written about the terror carried out by both sides in Nigeria, let's say. I don't like it, obviously, but I don't see any point in my giving them good or bad marks for it. On the other hand, if we were carrying out the terror, I would very definitely write about it. And I think, so there's no double standard as far as I can see. At least, let's say I have a standard in mind, one may or may not accept it.
We will explore that. Mr. Chomsky, we were talking there about American terror, and I think you make a very accurate observation that we are responsible for what we do, but hardly responsible for what other people do, except insofar as we are in a position to influence them.
That's right.
For instance, if there is a mass starvation in Biafra, even though we did not cause it, there is a sense in which we are responsible if we don't do something to attempt to alleviate it. Right. Now, by the same token, if we are prepared to agree that it is not always easy to taxonomize military action into that which is terroristic and that which is purely a military operation, we are left with doubts, for instance, about the bombing of Germany in 1942, 43, 44. Mm-hmm. You might contend that this was terroristic and unnecessary, and you might be right, although you're not a military expert, neither am I. But I think
there's a point to that.
Yeah, but I do judge that even if we all agree that what we did in Dresden was inexcusable, as a moral question, it's got to be understood in context of what was it that brought us to Dresden in the first instance.
Absolutely.
And what brought us to South Vietnam in the first instance, in my judgment, was clearly an uninterested, or I should say disinterested, concern for the stability and possibilities of a region of the world. What
period do you feel that we had this disinterested relationship to Vietnam?
Right now.
No, at what period did we have it? Did it begin? Let's say 1951, for example, when the State Department bulletin points out that we must help the French reconquer their former colony, and we must eradicate all Vietnamese resistance down to its last roots in order to reestablish the French in power. Was that disinterested?
To increase my vulnerability, I wish we had helped the French.
We did. We supported
but not
them.
Sufficiently. Not sufficiently.
Well, but
there's no point in helping somebody insufficiently.
It was hardly disinterested when we attempted, as with tremendous support, in fact, to reinstate French imperialism in South Vietnam.
Now, it was disinterested in this sense, and I think this is an important distinction which you do touch on in your book. It's a disinterested act if my attempt to help, or your attempt to help a particular nation, is in order to spare you the possibility of a great ordeal in the future, which will harm you, your family, your children, your republic.
And in that sense, Nazi Germany was also disinterested.
Yeah,
after all, Nazi Germany was conquering Eastern Europe only in order to advance the values of Christian spiritual civilization and to restore the Slavs to their rightful home and so on and so forth. Totally disinterested.
Look, I follow you. But if you want me to pursue that digression, I will.
Okay.
But let's suspend it for a moment.
Okay.
I'm distinguishing that kind of disinterestedness between the kind of...
But that's not a kind of disinterestedness. You see, that's something which includes as a special case every case of military aggression and colonialism in history. It's all disinterested in your sense.
Well, all right, let me simply rest my case by saying that there is an observable distinction by intelligent men between a country that reaches out and interferes with the affairs of another country because it has reason to believe that a failure to do so will result in universal misery, and that country which reaches out and interferes with another country because it wants to establish Coca-Cola plants there and chase national banks and whatever and exploit it. Now, that is an observable
It's a conceptual distinction. Well, let's distinguish between a conceptual distinction and a factual
I'm prepared to do that.
All right, it is a conceptual distinction, but in actual fact, the history of colonialism shows that these two motivations can coincide. That is, practically every, I mean, there are exceptions, you know, probably the Belgians and the Congo are an exception, but by and large, the major imperialist ventures have been in the economic, in the material interest or in the perceived material
I'm
interest.
not interested in the mathematics of the, but I'm interested.
Let me finish.
You have already conceded that it's not merely a conceptual difference.
I say it is.
There are exceptions.
There are a few exceptions.
All right.
Like I said,
Okay. All right, let's talk about the exceptions then.
Well, no, but the exceptions are at the difference. No, wait a minute. The exceptions. I mentioned, for example, the Belgians and the Congo. There, they didn't even pretend to have a civilizing mission. There, it was pure material self-interest. These are the exceptions. There are, as far as I know, no exceptions on the other side. There are. I mean, maybe I've left out a case of history, but as I see the history of colonialism, the great massive cases are cases where a powerful country was working in its perceived material self-interest and was covering what it was doing to itself and to the world with very pleasant phrases about preserving Christian values or helping the poor benighted natives or one thing or another. Now, there are a few exceptions where there's pure predatory imperialism. No, not even any pretense of doing anything, but these are quite rare.
But not
and we're in the
not
mainstream of imperialism in a sense. Pure predatory imperialism? I think it's quite
Sure,
rare.
the history of the Roman Empire.
Well, let's take one. I mean, since the Industrial Revolution.
Since the Industrial Revolution. Well,
You know, the history is quite
if you say that people have refined the art of apologetics, I don't deny it. But it is also true, and I think manifestly true, that there have been interferences with the affairs of other nations whose purposes were, in my judgment, manifestly benign.
For example?
Well, for instance, the Truman Doctrine.
Oh, I don't think that was manifestly benign at all. That was an attempt to develop an order.
I think
the Greek situation was benign, not at all. We were
I
trying
say
to...
the Greeks' testimony is more interesting to me than yours.
Which Greek testimony? The testimony of the thousands of people who were thrown into jail and...
I grant not the testimony of the Greek communists who were beaten.
Or the Greek peasants who were...
There again, is it a conceptual difference that between the person who desires a life under some kind of freedom and one who desires life under some kind of... under communism?
No, because there's no such opposition in Greece. There was a distinction between a very repressive regime, which we instituted in 1946, and another regime, I don't know what it would have been, that would have grown out of a victory of the so-called communists. Now, if you see, what we did had nothing to do with freedom. What we instituted was
This is absolute historical romantic, I would say, because the number of people who were slaughtered in Greece, first by the communist insurgency, then by the Nazis, then again by the communists, add up to an enormous
communist insurgency before the Nazis? Which one?
Not insurgency, conquest.
Communist conquest before the Nazis in Greece?
Communist insurgency.
Prior to the Nazis in Greece?
Yes, the civil war of the early 40s. My point is that the Greeks...
your history is quite confused there.
No, it isn't
actually. There was no communist insurgency prior to the Nazis. There were communist resistance bands that fought against the Nazis.
This is a matter of nomenclature. The point is that the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old Greek has fought 3 times in certain ventures, in one of which they acknowledged that we bailed them out.
Who is they? The rulers of Greece acknowledge that.
No, also the people.
I'm quite unaware of that. I'm quite unaware that the people of Greece have spoken on this issue.
Even Papandreou, you like him, I assume, because he hates us.
No, not at all.
Papandreou.
Not at all. George Papandreou was one of the people who was...
I'm talking about Andrea, which makes it even...
Has Andreas Papandreou
They're both on record as being grateful to President Truman for his intervention in that part of the world in 1947.
In that case, I disagree with him on that issue. I mean, I really do. I think we had no right to intervene in Greece in 1947.
No, now we're talking about rights,
and
which gets us away from the discussion.
All right, let's talk about whether we did it
whether or not there is such a thing as relatively disinterested international interference. And it seems to me that America's record is rather good. We went through an imperialist phase, but we pulled out of it faster than any country in the history of civilization.
I think we're very deep.
Why did we pull out of the Philippines, for instance?
We pulled out of the Philippines because it became a bad investment.
Why?
Because if you look, American agricultural interests were very much opposed to the, back in the mid-30s, they were very strongly opposed to the free trade relationships which allowed Philippine crops to compete with them. That's why we pulled out of the Philippines.
Why do these agricultural interests authorize us to intervene in South Vietnam?
They did.
If you consider this is...
Because we didn't intervene on the basis...
This is the critical dimension.
No, I say that in the Philippines it was the critical dimension. Look, the world is a complex place.
I'm aware of that.
There are certain interests that were involved...
MIT is a complex place.
Well, there were certain interests that were involved in our Philippine venture. There are different interests that are involved in our Vietnam venture. You see, our Vietnam... Don't forget that with the Second World War, America's imperial interests expanded enormously. I mean, prior to the Second World War, we were sort of a marginal imperialist power. except for the Monroe Doctrine. But since the Second World War, we became the world's major imperialist power. And Vietnam is simply one piece of an attempt to construct a very large integrated world system, of which Greece was another piece.
Yeah, we became an imperial power, Mr. Chomsky, in the sense that we inherited primary responsibility for any chain of action that might involve us in a Third World War.
I don't believe
and something that might involve the entire world in Holocaust. And
No,
under the circumstances, well, I know you don't believe it, but
in fact, I think that
it might be refreshing to listen to this point of view, which is that there are people who do believe that America, unhappily and certainly not desiring it, inherited the responsibility for trying to abort international Holocaust. And has from time to time done so by such ventures as the Truman Doctrine, martial aid, and things like that.
I don't agree with
martial aid. Mr. Greenfield.
Mr. Chomsky, you state in one of the essays in your book, the unpleasant fact is that if one wishes to pursue the Munich analogy, there is only one plausible candidate for the role of Hitler, and by that you mean the United States. There are other references to Nazi Germany's conduct of foreign policy and our own. And you also less emphatically suggest that a lot of the internal policies of the United States government have left millions of its own citizens hungry or exploited. If this is the fact, that is to say, if the nature of our society is functionally indistinguishable in this respect from Nazi Germany, then doesn't that legitimate any tactic that one wishes to use in opposition?
Well, I certainly don't believe that your assumption. That is, I don't believe, and I don't think I ever say that our society is functionally indistinguishable from Nazi Germany.
No, that's
what I say is that if one wants to pursue...
I want to zero in.
Yeah. So
If
I
by
would
blowing
disagree
up
with
a
the
troop train, we prevent 5,000 American soldiers from going to Vietnam to participate in what you do explicitly call a criminal war,
Right.
Isn't that a moral act?
Oh, I think that, yes, it would be. If sabotage would, in fact, contribute to ending the war, I would be in favor of sabotage. And let me give you some concrete examples.
So that's a tactical decision, not a moral
decision. In fact, I'll give you some examples. What the Berrigans have done, for example, at Catonsville and Milwaukee, I think is very heroic and, in fact, saintly.
But that is not killing American soldiers.
Oh, no, I'm not. Well, you were talking about sabotage.
I'm talking about blowing up a troop train. I would assume there'll be loss of life.
I'm sorry. I thought you meant, let's say, stop preventing a train from going.
No, I mean blowing up. I mean sabotage, assassination. What all the heroes in America.
I would first of all make a sharp distinction, as for example the Berrigans did, between attacks on property and attacks on people.
That's what I want to know.
Fundamental distinction. But then, you see, if one raises the question about attacks on people, then I think there are very tricky issues. See, I can concede, I would have been against assassinating Hitler, for example, because I'm against murder. But if I believed that assassination of Hitler would have really contributed to ending the war, I think one could have given an argument. Now, if it were true,
Mutatis Lyndon Johnson?
And that would pertain to Lyndon Johnson. But in neither case, incidentally, do I think that it tactically would have.
But I think Mr. Doxey has a question for you.
They also put it this way: do you believe in a natural law, in transcendental truth, let's say, affixing social union?
I think that there's something to the doctrine of natural law, but I think that that's much more abstract than anything we've been discussing here.
Well, but wouldn't that then justify the use of terror in, let's say, stopping a tenet of the natural law from being broken, or stopping, let's say, the ends from...
Let's bring it down to earth. I see, I'm, of course, opposed to terror. Any rational person is. But I think that if we're serious about the question of terror, if we're serious about the question of violence, we have to recognize that that it is a tactical and hence moral matter. Incidentally, tactical issues are basically moral issues. They have to do with human consequences. And if we're interested in, let's say, diminishing the amount of violence in the world, it's at least arguable, and perhaps even sometimes true, that a terroristic act does diminish the amount of violence in the world. Hence, a person who is opposed to violence will not be opposed to that terroristic act.
Walt Ross says exactly the same thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now,
and he happens to be wrong in the case in which he applies it.
No,
you see, these principles tell you very little about real cases.
No, but that's I must say, that's the one thing that bothers me more about what you've been saying than the way you write. That kind of language, that is the notion of a terroristic act which restricts consequent violence, is precisely what Rostow says in The View from the Seventh Floor, when after this whole analysis about the moral world, he says there's not a single place where we don't have major military might to support it.
I think that the real point here is that when you try to formulate general principles that will apply to arbitrary political affairs, you find that you can only make very vacuous and empty statements. See, if one wants to talk in perfect abstraction from any real situation about the justification for violence and terror, then you come up with platitudes and empty remarks and so on. The point is that you know, there are no very general principles that apply to such circumstances, or if there are, no one has enunciated and formulated them. So what one really has to do is look at the concrete historical situation. Now, where I would disagree, maybe Rostow and I would agree at this level of abstraction on the use of violence to prevent less violence, greater violence. Where we would disagree is in our evaluation of what is happening in this concrete historical situation.
So therefore,
and that's where one's attention ought to...
So therefore you have no philosophical objection to the way in which Mr. Rostow states his case, merely to its applicability in existing circumstances.
No, I say at this level I might not. I don't know what he says
but
about
he wouldn't
that.
Other things.
But in other things I have very great difference. For example, Walt Rostow says that we should try to strengthen, that the great threat of China to us is that it will succeed and provide a model to other countries. And we have to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Is that why you kept him out of MIT?
I assure you that I had nothing to do with keeping him out of MIT. I'd be delighted to have him back. He's a great help to us when he's around.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chomsky, and thank you all.